believe in the ripple effect.
What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Ricardo Hernandez, also known as Ricky Verance, and a great episode for you today. Today we have Dave Zed from the Generation Z podcast. I'll put links to his stuff in the show description as always. And some of you guys might be familiar with his work because he's been a guest on the Union of the Unwanted a bunch of times and always brings some really interesting perspectives and information. And he's a part of some really interesting stuff, some suppressed technology or rediscovering some old technology. We talk about Tesla, we talk about ancient aliens, we talk about Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson's work. We talk about science, reality, consciousness, and much more. So hold on tightly. You're about to go on a hell of a ride. But before you go on that ride, I have to remind you guys this is a value for value show. So please, if you get some value out of this discussion or any of the great conversations I try to bring to you guys, please consider giving some value back. If you can't financially support the show, you can rate the show, subscribe to the show on all the platforms we're on, tell people about the show, and do your best to try to get the word out there. But if you can support the show financially, please consider doing so. You don't have to support with a lot of money. Even $1 a month would go a long way. And like I always remind you guys, if a small percentage of all the listeners and downloaders donated as little as $1 a month, I could easily do this full time. And I know sometimes it's obvious that I'm distracted or I'm not as focused as I should be. And that's because I don't do this show full time. So if you want to help with that, if you want to do more than just complain about your favorite podcaster's performance, please consider helping those podcasters. Support the people that help you get this thought-provoking information, these thought-provoking conversations, expose you to some new ideas, and you don't have to donate much to help us. Like I said, as little as $1 a month on Patreon goes a long way. We also have a PayPal account, crypto wallet, and a Venmo account if you want to send a one-time donation. We have a merch store with tons of hoodies, t-shirts, mugs, kids' clothes, and with the holidays right around the corner, please consider checking out the merch store, maybe getting some Christmas presents there. We also have some sponsors like Content Safe, and Content Safe saves me tons of time because what they do is they sync all my video channels together. So I upload my videos to one place, and then soon after they appear on all the video platforms I'm on. So please check out Content Safe. Let them know that you're a listener of the Ripple Effect Podcast, and they will hook you up. Another sponsor is the University of Reason, created by Richard Grove, the host of the very popular show Grand Theft World, which you can find on Rockfin and many other video platforms. But if you're at a crossroads in life, if you're looking to expand some skills, learn some new skills, connect with the community, check out the University of Reason and the very popular autonomy courses. You can find the links to all these things and much more on my website, rippleeffectpodcast.com, or in the show description. But go to the University of Reason, and by signing up, you're helping yourself and you're helping the Ripple Effect Podcast at the same time. So please check it out. My last sponsor is Element Electrolytes. I drink this stuff every day. It was created and founded by Rob Wolf, who is a OG in the paleo and keto community, one of the smartest people in regards to nutrition. And he created a electrolyte powder mix you can put in your water, or if you get the chocolate flavors, you can put it in your coffee, and you can get your caffeine and stay hydrated at the same time. And you can add some flavor to your coffee, add some flavor to your water with something that has no sugar, has no artificial flavors or sweeteners. It's good for you, and it can help with a lot of different symptoms like headache and fatigue, a lot of different things that come with being dehydrated. That's it, guys. Enjoy this amazing conversation. Also, check out our Telegram group chat for all the people who want to connect with other listeners or connect with myself. And I will talk to you guys on the next one. Peace.
I believe
every time you jump on the You've Unwanted, I'm like, I need to get Dave on. I'm like, I need to talk to Dave. You always have the most interesting things and perspectives to share. And I know I've been on your show a while ago, but you've never been on mine. And one, I want to, if I can, like maybe get some of my listeners to check out your show if they're not familiar with it. But also, there's so many interesting things going on right now, and some of the things we talked about on the last You've Unwanted, which I know that you're aware of. Also, the last appearance of Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson on Rogan. Those conversations intertwine a little bit, and there's some things that they talked about on there that immediately made me think of you and some of the stuff you were saying on the last show. And it's a topic that I'm super curious about because I've had people on, which, obviously I think we've talked about too, like Dr. Thomas Cowan and Rupert Sheldrake. And I love anybody who makes us rethink what we think we know and goes, pushes back against the grain and makes you reanalyze things and puts in perspective that our understanding of the world could be wrong or misinterpreted, and there's much more to explore and understand. So I guess I'm already doing too much talking. Let's we'll jump right into it. For people who are listening who might not be familiar with the show that I referenced, your background, any of that stuff, let people know who Dave is.
Sure. Well, first off, Ricky, I want to thank you so much, man, for even asking me to come on. When I got your email to come on, I was like, sweet. Okay. That's the reason why I wanted to make sure today was still happening, because I was super excited. And the people that you have on your show are such a vast plethora of people. But before we get into all of that, my real name is David Rossi. I've gone recently, last few years, since I've started the Generation Z podcast show as Dave Zed, sort of to try and give a bit more, I guess you could say, leniency to the Gen Z crowd with respects to, a lot of people say, this generation, they're not, they're always on TikTok or whatever. I think, sure, there are, lazy individuals, absolutely. But at the same time, I think there's just a different type of learning experience that I think, whether organically from a perhaps spiritual, esoteric, or even, let's not go that far, intuitive perspective, that a lot of people my age are looking to learn about. That's why I called the show that. We go into everything from current global affairs to politics, all the way to scientific research and development, all of that. But long story short, the last year and a half of my life, to be honest, took a very interesting turn, because where I ended up now, I had no intent of ending up. So what happened was that I had started my show, Generation Z Podcast, but I started talking about the UAP UFO phenomenon. But then the more I pursued the subject, the more I realized that this phenomenon intertwined, in my opinion, at least, I could be wrong, but in my humble opinion, with extrasensory perception, with psychology, with neurology, with the brain sciences, with the occult. So in other words, to me, at least, to study the phenomenon was to study life itself. But what happened essentially was that, I'll tell you, about a year ago, I started using the show as well, more so on the member side on our patreon.com/Generation Z, to pursue more of the scientific aspects. I said, okay, not everyone's interested in it, so I'll kind of, focus a bit more on the members end there. And then I just started, like, I guess you could say, self-teaching with the sciences and all of that, chemistry, optics, electrical engineering, quantum physics, all of that. And then I started just reading. And then I said to myself, there's so much discussion and speculation, whether it's in the UFO community or otherwise, on what any type of, whether it's Bigfoot, whether it's Sasquatch, whether it's, an extraterrestrial abduction, whether it's an out-of-body experience. I said to myself, why not try and pursue what could be needed to develop such in a practical sense? So long story short, I was messing around in a backyard with some stuff. It ended up working. But then what happened was that I said to myself, I need to learn the theoretical side to fully grasp it. So I say this in the most, to your audience and yourself, the most humblest way possible and respectful way. At this point in time, essentially, I'm completely surrounded by academics with respects to some of this stuff, because when I had turned this, I call it my generator version 1. When I had turned it on many months ago, without knowing, now I understand much more of it, but without knowing, it basically set off an alarm or a ripple, if you will, sort of like an EMP does, to a military base that was about 40 minutes from where I was staying at the time. And long story short, it started setting off all these alarms. And then after, basically, I kept turning the generator on and on again, then off, then on again. I started getting emails from people in military intelligence out of nowhere, like completely saying, hey, we like your show, this and that, yada, yada. And what was interesting about all of this was that I found that, particularly in the last 6 months, something, I guess you could say something flipped in me, in the sense that I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, I found my passion with respects to this particular area, which is not anti-gravity propulsion as much as it actually is consciousness, but we'll get into that. And so what started happening was, people, whether it was, I started, making, networking, making friends and all of this, and people started in the last 4 or 5 months reaching out to me privately. And some of these people, and currently I'm under NDA with all of them, actually, so I can't say their names, but some of these people are in fact individuals from Hollywood, whether actors, singers. They would call me and they would say, Dave, we've heard of your show, we like your show, but we're afraid of the stigma or the dogma publicly to discuss this kind of stuff. And I said, well, what stuff? They go, well, we think we were abducted. And I spoke to a couple in which spent over, I will say, $700,000 of their own money to have an investigation into what happened to them, and they still could not find out what happened. So I said to myself, all right, I'm beginning to, establish the network, both in the public domain, in the podcasting sphere, and within, albeit very carefully, the Department of Defense and other governments around the world. Essentially, I said, all right, maybe I should do something where, I consult or something like this. So I opened a company called SALT LLC, Strategic Analysis and Assessment of Longitudinal Technologies. And since then, my main focus at this point actually is in, essentially, there are a lot of people at the very top that are looking to basically, for lack of a better term, it may sound crazy, but to those on the, I guess you could say, in the know, if you will, one doesn't have to be government. There's a keen interest in storing consciousness, essentially, or at least being able to move it from one, what's been, body, container, vessel, you name it, to another. There's been a proposal or a hypothesis that we as spirits, if you will, may be plasma beings inside of a carbon container, with respects to, if you, for example, if I were to have, say, my legs cut off, my arms cut off, and all of that, I'm still me. So the question is, what makes me me? What makes Ricky Ricky? You see what I'm saying? That's the ultimate question. And so then, I started doing research mixed in with the science, in which I had essentially, by fluke of practical, you could say, I don't want to say engineering because I don't have any degree at all, but making stuff, essentially cracked various forms of anti-gravity. But then I went on the dark web, and then I essentially did some stuff that substantiated even more of what I was doing, and got certain groups and entities' attention, and said, listen, either you disappear me or we play ball here, because I do believe that some of this tech and knowledge can come out. Unfortunately, I will say that I see how and why a lot of it's been suppressed, because it can be weaponized so easily. As simple as, for example, I'll tell you, if, say, this pen, when it's in a vertical position, it can, cure cancers, let's say, which in my opinion, there is tech that can do that. But then you turn it sideways, and then it becomes, say, a rail gun. This becomes the issue. It puts guns out of business. If you have a terrorist that gets a hold of this stuff, they put a localized force field around them, there's a big issue. Now, I know these are bold claims, but I will say as well that everything that I do at this point behind the scenes and all that is with advisory committees and with the academics, all of this stuff with respects to substantiating the science behind this. I'm of the humble opinion, if there's any potential secret UAP, UFO development program, again, I would respectfully ask you and your audience to read between the lines. This is just my experience, my opinion. The UFO, in terms of cracking propulsion, that stuff was cracked World War II. The concern is much larger than that, in my opinion. Dare I say that it's maybe perhaps even a spiritual concern. And what I mean by that is, we see, for example, that when one goes to watch a movie, let's say, and we go watch a movie and we see that there's a projector, which is a nuts and bolts physical object that is projecting light onto a projector for us to watch for our entertainment. I would dare to say that this reality is the other way around, in the sense that light, what we would call light, is projecting something to Earth in order to create a nuts and bolts product, if you will. And this goes back to, Plato's allegory of the cave. This goes back to Plato's, Atlantis, Platonic solids, all of this. There's if I have a coffee cup here, there's a perfect image of this cup, or a perfect example of this cup in a metaphysical sense, or in a universe or a reality that we are not in currently. So forgive me for the ramble, but essentially it went from, very interestingly enough, and graciously, a podcast to suddenly getting into all of this. So I mean, yeah, I will say, and I truthfully, I'm not saying it towards you, but people can call me crazy. Have zero I have zero I guess you could say
You can swear. Zero Fs.
no, I give zero fucks. I have no remorse in that regard. So because here's the thing, it can be scientifically substantiated. And I do agree that, as a matter of fact, this technology or underlying energy may be the same underlying energy that ancient cultures have discussed, whether it's what people recently call 0 point energy. I know that's a big thing in Fortnite these days, whether it's what, for example, Dr. Salvatore Paez, the UFO Navy patent guy, calls the super force. And this is not a jab or any disrespect to any of my religious friends, but dare I say, this may in fact be, from my personal experimentation, the same underlying energy that perhaps Jesus Christ called the Holy Spirit, with respects to merging the world of the very large and the world of the very small, the world of physics and metaphysics, this idea of creating in what's in science known as a unified field theory, or an answer to everything. Now, why? I mean, that opens up a lot of different, doorways with respects to questions. Why would it be covered up? Why would it, all of that? But long story short, I presented to multiple departments of multiple areas of the Department of Defense in the United States, some in person, some digitally, this and that, multiple governments from around the world. All these governments have this stuff. Some of it a good chunk of it should come out, in my opinion. There is some that I think will actually make people go a little bit cuckoo, and I will be fair, even including myself, because I'm not one to talk, but I would say that there is this stuff should come out for many in many different regards, or at least a good chunk of it should.
Where do I start? Yeah, the weapons thing, that's very fascinating. It's also understandable. That's always something that I've thought about, is that if the government did have some type of technology that we could utilize or manipulate whatever things or whatever it may be, of course it would eventually, if not immediately, be used for some type of weapon or some terrorism or whatever it may be. So that's always a concern, of course. And I think initially we think, oh, technology is suppressed because there's markets, there's businesses, and they want to milk that cow as long as they can, and new technology would put those businesses basically bankrupt. But it also, when you think about how advanced some of this technology could be, obviously you have to jump to that weapon conclusion, of like, okay, well, maybe that's the fear, is really just it being used as a weapon. Tesla, I believe that, even Randall Carlson talked about it, like that was a concern of his. It's funny how a lot of this mysterious stuff that revolves around Tesla, like I know him trying to talk to people from other planets, free energy, the fact that all his documents were taken from by the CIA and whatnot, or FBI, whichever one. And all this stuff, you start connecting all these dots. That's the kind of the fun thing about doing these podcasts, and also the fun thing of being a researcher and a curious person in general, because I think that's kind of what came first, is like you're a curious person, then you start researching, then you're like, let me start a podcast and expand my curiosity, is that you find these puzzle pieces, and they don't necessarily, you don't know where they fit, but you keep them, and then eventually you find, oh, it fits here. And the Tesla thing, same thing, right? Like, it's like, why would they raid him? Why would they put him out of business? Why?
Well, I could sort of cut you off. I could say that some of the things that I'm working on with right now with some people, that some private groups that I'm working with, to try and get some of this stuff into the international peer-reviewed literature publicly, because the usually it's, you get it into the literature publicly, the scientists take a couple years to even more to suture it, to get the methodology correct of the theory. They then translate it to the engineers, it goes commercial, then it goes consumer to market. So some of the people that I'm working with in that regard, to get some of my papers that I've done for DoD into the global peer-reviewed literature have expressed the same thing, same concern in that regard. And I'm not trying to justify this as a reason why it should stay hidden, but at the same time, the unfortunate thing is that I'm of the humble opinion, and again, I am not saying I have cracked the way. I'm saying I've cracked a set of ways. There may be some other people out there that have cracked various forms of it in different ways that I have not, to be fair. What I mean by that is essentially, if you want to call it anti-gravity zero-point energy, but the issue is, brother, is that I'm of the humble opinion when you crack what's called anti-gravity and you understand it conceptually, and then one understands how to even write the equations and then apply it in an engineering sense, you crack the rest. What do I mean by the rest? This is where it may sound a bit bold, but it can be scientifically substantiated, but it's just been hidden in the literature. You crack, by cracking anti-gravity, you are tapping that same energy, that same underlying substrate of telekinesis, stargates, being able to see into various points in time, what we would call the future, the past, you name it, perhaps even different realities, walking through portals to other ends of the planet, you name it. And again, it's probably possible. And what I found quite peculiar was someone whom I admire and regard very highly, Dr. Hal Puthoff, had said something about a year and a half ago where he said at a conference, he goes, I think we should put the science aside for a while. In my interpretation, he was alluding to the confinement in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, a very confined sort of set of ways that people abide by, rules they abide by, that if one questions outside of that box, it's, my gosh, you're get out of my face type thing. But what stood out to me was when he said, we should forget the science for a while and leave all possibilities on the table until there's enough data to take them off the table. And usually an investigator, a researcher, even a scientist, they start with a metaphorically clean slate, an empty table, and they put things on that table when there's enough data to put it on the table. This time, it's the other way around, at least with respects to some of these scientists whom largely their work has been classified. So again, to me, that's telling. So, but I completely 100% hear what you're saying. It's a slippery slope right now. And if I may say as well, I agree with Randall Carlson when he says plasmoids having to do with implosion instead of explosion. And when he said that it's been matured, absolutely. In my opinion, at 100%. That's why I'm pursuing something, I guess you could say, larger in that regard with respects to, there are a lot of people that are looking on, I guess you could say, there are some people that are looking on for how to die properly. For example, I know this may sound ridiculous, but I'll just give an out there example. You have WikiLeaks, the Hillary Clinton email where she wanted the body of Gilgamesh dropped at, Area 51, Groom Lake. Again, it's there. It's never been discredited, but it's just been completely ignored. You have people, for example, that are looking to induce perhaps certain memories, very similar to that of the total recall concept. You have people that are looking to take something organic or natural or have a state induced in a concealed room or pod or something where 5 minutes go by in the real world, but they just had a 1-year vacation in that pod. Because if one can manipulate the idea of, I guess you could say, sorry, I gotta watch my words here, but time, by manipulating time, you can manipulate space and therefore the perception of that relative to you as the local observer. And this speaks to, dare I say, simulation theory and what we call the reality, or this reality at the very least. So that's where I would go in that regard. So, I mean, for example, I'd be more than happy to show you at some point in our episode what I showed on the Union of the Unwanted, a Department of Defense slide on demons, the way that they operate. For example, if we have a stack of 10 books, book 1 starting at the bottom, going up to 10 at the top. We live in a world where you and I are only experiencing, observing book number 10 at the top. And everything like this water bottle is only, we are observing, sensing. My body is now sending, we could say, electromagnetic pulses through my nerves to the neurons in my brain that are saying, you're holding this water bottle. You are seeing this bottle on the camera, therefore it must be quote unquote real because we are both seeing it. But the question then becomes, if I remove the bottle from you seeing it and I put it behind my, say for example, like this, behind my head where none of us can see it, is it really still there? And I'm not saying I have the answer, but what's interesting about these slides of which I obtained is that what we could call ghosts, Sasquatch, demons, you name it, are beings that exist on the lower stack of books. Book 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and they jump up to book 10 when they want to create and effectuate a change in our reality. So this would imply as well, that as Tesla claimed there was an ether. I would agree very strongly. So that's where I go with that.
Yeah, so it sounds like almost if there was a apartment complex or a hotel and there's floors, right? And it's like there could be people on lower floors, but you're on the top floor and you're
Right.
just not aware and you don't see them, but they're there. And so yeah, it's very interesting. The thing is, like, all these concepts, like I remember back in the day watching a documentary, Planned Obsolescence. When you look at all the technology that's been suppressed, you look at like and this is just like not very hard to believe stuff. This is like, the trolley car conspiracy, right? When the GM and Firestone bought all the trolley cars and you use a front company and then pushed PVTA buses, and then you look at like the light bulb conspiracy, to how light bulbs kept progressing and they were lasting a long time, and then all the companies got together and said, hey, we have to make them last less time, so then we can make more money and all this stuff. And I think it was also the iPhone or the i something by Apple that like would I think within a year they would all fail, and then they got sued by somebody, and then the papers were released in court, and it showed that it was designed to do that. And then you look at documentaries like Gas Hole and also the documentary Pump, which I had an automotive engineer from that documentary on, which you see in car technology and engine technology, how with very little modifications, you can make any car run off ethanol, how the diesel engine was designed to run off peanut oil and vegetable oil, and so and then I think initially, like, the fastest land car was a electric car back in the early 1900s, something like
Yeah.
that. So it was all this stuff. So you start connecting the dots and gathering the pieces, like, okay, obviously there's been some technology suppression throughout history, stuff that's very believable, stuff that's very, so now you start taking that in consideration. And then you look at people like I mentioned before, Dr. Ruber Sheldrake, who pushes the boundaries on what we understand about consciousness and memory and all these things. Then you take somebody like Dr. Thomas Cowan, and not just him, but there's many other people who make us rethink what water is, and if there's some type of consciousness or something to it. You see all those experiments about staring at water or playing music while freezing it, and then based on how you feel when you're looking at it or what type of music you're playing, the crystals will freeze differently and give you images. So
Yeah.
this all pushes the boundaries on what we understand. Then you look at, like we said, like you look at Tesla, and then this all kind of makes you think also, okay, what about the cult? What about the Freemasons? Like, the Freemasons always seem to have this understanding of mathematics, and there's all this the same numbers will pop up in different just holy books and ancient civilizations, and you wonder if there was some type of mathematics or something that they understood, that some code that was broken to understand the world in a way that we don't understand it, and which is the only explanation I can come up with when you look at the pyramids and all these other ancient places that we have now. Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson are really pushing the boundaries in regards to how old some of these things are, but also like the pyramids, how perfect they are, and there's still not a realistic, logical explanation on how they built them. So all this, my point is, like, all these things seem separate, but they really aren't, right? They're all,
To your point, there are, what I can say is that there are academic papers on restricted government servers, not just in North America, that definitively state that there have been, dare I say, even we could say, for example, what we now call quantum communication, which a lot of people don't even know what that means. And I don't blame them whatsoever because it's so deliberately freaking vague. But this idea of telekinesis, whether with a chip in the brain or otherwise in a more organic sense, there are papers on restricted servers that literally discuss and talk about how the ancients had it, and it's perhaps we may be a species that are, and I agree with this humbly, but we are a species rediscovering the same underlying, we could say, energies, if you will. Now, I also want to mention that, in my opinion, there's a very significant difference between science and technology. A very, very significant difference. We have, for example, in the sciences, we have things like alchemy, right? We have things like, for example, people would call it, perhaps witchcraft. I don't mean to allude to stigmatize any one particular label here, but for example, if we look at, let's say, even like you were saying, the Freemasons, I will say that there's definitely something there because the science substantiates it. Now, I pulled up a paper here, not to, just to show you and your audience, to make a point, essentially. And the point I want to make is to show the deliberate, in my opinion, complication in the academic community in order to butcher this stuff so people don't crack it. So unfortunately, to your audience, not to worry, you guys don't have to worry about this stuff, but these are some equations. I know just my writing is terrible, but these are some equations that I've been running, and this stuff is not, in my humble opinion, this stuff is not particularly needed. The equations, I'm not trying to take a jab at anyone that's actually genuinely progressed the sciences, but what we see is a butchering in academia of chemistry, optics, engineering of various kinds, electrical, ceramic, electronics engineering, physics, propulsion. So, if you're a chemist, Ricky, and I'm a physics guy, Ricky, you're, instead of actually saying in a genuinely good faith way, Ricky, sir, what do you think about this particular paper, for example? You may know something or see something that I'm missing. Instead of having those conversations, it's ad hominem attacks, emotional attacks. Oh, screw you. You're a chemist. Stay in your lane. I'm a physicist. I'm of the humble opinion we need to have all slices of that pizza come together, or else this is not going to get cracked. And that's why I think as well it's being so deliberately hidden. And then those that do crack it either disappear or somehow skirt their way into being able to, to take advantage of it, of which I'm trying to do, but also reciprocate that in a benevolent fashion to the masses. I think that we can do much better than people starving on streets. 100%. I think we need to be able to lift everybody up. I think there's enough money for everyone to be happy. I think that the greed has gone far too far along the line, and this has to stop. So again, if I am pushing it a bit, but that's the point of why I'm even doing this. So, one person asked me after a presentation, someone from representing a certain group said, you're not afraid of, if anything might happen to you. They were not threatening me. They were just asking. I looked them dead in the eye and I go, and again, people can call me crazy. I said, I can do more damage outside of my body than in it. So kill me. And then they kind of got a little bit spooked because, dare I say, in my humble opinion, the simulation theory may be, or this video game idea may be a little more on the money than some may think. Now, I could be wrong. I'm only speaking on behalf of what I've seen in laboratories, experiments, and what I've done myself in some papers with respects to modeling and things like that. But yeah, that's where I, and oh, sorry, one last thing, if I may say, to give your audience an example of how perhaps tapping some of this energy works. Because if people say, okay, Dave, if you could tap it, where does it come from? Well, this is when science and magic sort of become intertwined, if you will. And I think it also speaks to a philosophical angle, but I'll get to that in a moment. So imagine you're washing the dishes in your kitchen and you're done washing the dishes and you squeeze the sponge and all the water comes out of the sponge. As you squeeze it, then let it go, then squeeze it again, right? You're pulsing the sponge. Imagine the water coming out of that sponge is actually coming from a whole other house. It's not coming from inside the sponge. It's coming out of the sponge, and the sponge is acting as a medium or doorway to let it in, but it's the water itself is coming from someone else's sink entirely, if that may make sense. Now, how that's the case, unfortunately, I can't elaborate, but the reason I bring this up, Ricky, is because this is one of the things that I find to be one of the most, dare I say, enlightening situations, which is that the more I learn, the more freaking questions I have, man, which to me speaks to the joy is in the journey. This idea of, okay, it's magic until it can be substantiated with data, so then it's science. But then you discover more unexplained things within that science, and it keeps going and going and going, right? This is why some have said, well, there can't be a theories of everything, because within those theories, there's theories within those, and it's fractal. One must keep pursuing it. Well, I think we've cracked privately a theory of everything for this reality. I can't say for outside of this reality, but that's where I go with that. I think I think a lot of people also, this idea of when someone's in line for that new iPhone, or someone's in line for that new purse or Victoria's Secret lingerie or whatever. A lot of times, the pursuit of the product is more ideologically thrilling than when they actually get the product. They have to convince themselves in some cases when they purchase the product, yeah, no, it was worth that wait in line. When in reality, this speaks to the idea of marketing. People are pursuing an idea more than the product itself. I'm not saying that's always the case, but with respects to higher brand products, I think it's the same concept. Hence why I say to study the phenomenon is to study life, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, yeah, and what you're talking about, you're referring to Edward Bernays and his tactics of subconsciously getting you to want something. And one of my favorite bands growing up was Hatebreed, and they had an album called Satisfaction is the Death of Desire. And I remember always like thinking about that. Satisfaction is the death of desire. I'm like, he's right. And so it makes you think like, okay, that kind of makes sense when you think about the journey being more important than the destination, because once you're satisfied, desire's gone, and desire is what keeps us going and wanting. So that's what basically that saying means, is satisfaction is the death of desire. It kind of puts in perspective the fact that like desire, that once you're satisfied, desire is gone, and that's with everything. So it's like the longer you can hold on to that desire, the longer you're going to want those things. But one thing I love that you were saying, and I remember this is something I used to talk about back in the day with when Douglas Rushkoff was coming on from time to time, and this idea, and I'm sure you're familiar with Douglas. He wrote President Shock and a bunch of stuff, but he also has a very similar philosophy as you, and I tend to agree with him, and I like this idea. I know we live in a world now where it's like everything's political and everything's looked at from a political lens. So saying this will sound like we're a bunch of socialists, big government idiots. But this idea that technology could basically, instead of right now, it's enslaving us, but it could it could be used to free us in regards to like work, doing things that don't necessarily need to be done by humans, and labor jobs, and when you look at like humans just evolving, and of course we'll get into if that evolvement is one straight line, or if there's a line, then an explosion, and then we start over and whatever. But you look at humans evolving, like the whole idea of technology was to give us more free time, right? Like we created a better tool so we could kill the animal faster or catch the animal faster. We created a faster vehicle to get from A to B quicker. We created planes so we could travel faster, and all these things. And it's like all this, and when you have free time, there is a I've said this before with Dr. Jessica Rose, and she's like, oh, that's interesting. This idea of leisure, right? The importance of leisure time, and the importance of downtime, because that's when you think. And the whole point of technology advancing was to give us more thinking time, right? Like more time to ponder, more time to be curious, more time to question things and wonder about things. And you see that throughout history, where it's like, okay, when we spend less time hunting and gathering, that's when we start coming up with these other philosophies and these thinkers and poetry and all this stuff. And now we're almost retracting, where we're going in the opposite direction. We're like, now we should have unlimited amount of time to ponder and think and question the nature of the universe and consciousness and reality. And instead, we're enslaved by the same technology. So I love this idea of like, okay, we should expect more out of the world. I mean, this guy almost reminds me of like the Venus Project back in the day, and and Peter Joseph with the Zeitgeist movement, and really like this idea of like kind of using technology to make the world a better place. and I think we're capable of it. We're capable of more. I always say, and I defend your generation quite often with
Thank
conversations with people, because I was born in Portugal, and a lot of the Europeans that came to America, they're very hardworking. They came here, they worked their ass off, and financially they did get ahead, right? But
you.
they lost a lot of things. There was a sacrifice that was lost in that process, and that sacrifice was you lost the free time with your, time with your friends, time with your family. You lost that leisure time. You lost, some of that, and so you have more material wealth, but are you happier? And that's a huge thing. And when I look at Europeans, Western Europeans, go back to Portugal, yeah, I have family that doesn't work. They don't have as many ones and zeros in the bank account. They might not have a big house. They might not even own a house or a car, but they're happier. So it's like, okay, what's progress? And so I tend to have this idea that like we're kind of tricked into believing that like work is always good, regardless if it's fulfilling, if it achieves anything, if it makes you happy, that just work's always good. You look at like the younger generation and or even your generation, because I know a lot of people who are looking to hire people and they're like, oh, young people don't want to work on weekends. Young people don't want to, and I'm like, well, what's more valuable than time? You've been brainwashed and believing the most valuable thing is money. So when somebody doesn't want to work on weekends for that money, you look at it as like, what's wrong with this person? They're lazy. Well, what if they figured out that all the people who were pursuing money their whole lives are now divorced and on antidepressants and are unhappy because they're looking for happiness in the wrong place? And what's more valuable is having that weekend. Even if you don't have any plans, just having that weekend to decide to go do something, or maybe decide to do nothing. But either way, not being a slave to some corporate machine that is just trying to, take all the best years of your life and all your energy and all your time, and yet, are probably at the end aren't going to be really grateful for all the time invested in their business. So it's like, to me, it's just a different perspective. It's a different way of looking at the world. I don't look at you, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's plenty of examples of lazy people, but there's
Sure.
lazy people at my age at 37. I'm 85 baby. But I don't think the vast majority of people, your age or younger, who are jumping into the workforce, and they don't want to work, not because they're lazy, but maybe because they just don't value money the same way. When we were growing up, if I wanted access to information, if I wanted access to music, movies, any entertainment, I needed money. It required money. So it ended up building this worldview, or where it's like, okay, I respect money, I need money, because even though it's not money itself that I'm desiring. It's just a ends, means to an end. Like, it gets me the thing I want. So
Right.
having this respect for it and wanting it. And people grew up in that world. Now people are growing up in the world where, like, I have access, like you said, you don't have a PhD in any of these things, but you can talk to PhDs and hold a conversation with just about anybody, because you have access to all the information. You have access to movies, lectures, all this stuff. Where before, universities had a monopoly on education and information, because if you couldn't afford to go to the university, you're fucked. You didn't have access to these professors or books or whatever. But now that's not the case, and you basically can be as curious as you want and learn from the experts anytime you want, listen to any music you want. So you grew up in a world where it's like, okay, why am I going to enslave myself and work 80 hours a week to get money, when all the things that make me happy that I can get from free Wi-Fi at Starbucks? So it's like, to me, it's a different worldview. And I forget what the hell my point was on this long rant, but feel free
Well,
to expand on it. By the way, I did also make you co-host, so if you ever want to share screen.
oh, sure. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So in other words, to your point of what you're saying, if I actually wanted to write some things down, because you're making some fantastic points. If I may say, for those interested in the more nerdy science into your audience, if I may recommend a paper by Gina Mondini and Ezio Gagliardi called DNA Modification via Remote Intent, implying that laboratory experiments have been done, not just theoretical, but legitimate. Also, work has been done by someone by the name of Mr. Dean Radin, where this idea of intent changing the local environment around you relative to what people would call manifestation, for example. Now, we can take it one step further when we could talk about, people have claimed to stand in the same vicinities as certain people, and cancers are cured and things like that. That's more of the, I guess you could say, perhaps out there stuff. But the main concept here ultimately is that, to your point, Ricky, it's not there are always going to be lazy people, but to me it's this idea of, for example, money can always be made, but time cannot be brought back. Now, that's actually, to tell you the truth, that's one of the things I'm working on with what I'm doing with SALT, where preserving time relative to one's perception. Because if time is something that is perceived only relative to us as an individual, then could that be, and this may not be the most appropriate word, but could that be manipulated for that individual's benefit, for example, right? So that's what I'm working on with respects to that. But to your point about money, this concept of, self-reliance, decentralization, and all of that, it's very similar to this idea of, well, okay, if there are a set of individuals at the top that run the world, and I'm summarizing here, whether it's, with oil, pharmaceuticals, you name it, God forbid people have time to sit at home and think about what they love, what they want to do with their lives. God forbid. It's always, no, honey, I gotta go pay the bills and I got to get to work and this and that. And you're always rushing somewhere, but you're never getting to the place that you want to be, whether literally or metaphorically. For example, I have some friends, family friends, they say, to me and my family, Dave, a mortgage paid off, nice cottage, about to retire, pension, but something is not missing here in the head. Something's missing here. They don't know what it is. Now, dare I say, that is what we could call spiritual, but I don't mean that we have to become, all, love and light and this and that. What I mean essentially is that, for example, when people say, oh, Dave, this esoteric spiritual stuff is nonsense, I will say humbly, and I could be wrong, but every avenue that I take with respects to studying various forms of the literature academically in every subject of the sciences and the mathematics, whether it's from the 1700s or whether it's from this month, the different pursuits or avenues I take when I try and run the equations, when I try and use different functions, operators, you name it, whether it's with Dr. Richard Feynman's papers, Dr. Hal Puthoff's papers, for example, Sir Roger Penrose's papers, Nicholas Gissen's papers, out of University of Geneva, Switzerland. It all comes back to that same example, in my interpretation at least. And I try and interpret in various ways, but it seems to come back to that same example of light is creating something that we call nuts and bolts. It is making certain other light, we could say, particle fluctuations oscillate or vibrate so quickly, it makes up what we call a physical product, if you will. Now, the reason I bring all of that up is because it's this idea of, for example, speaking of intent, we see that people talk about, okay, if spirituality is completely nonsense. Well, we now know, for example, that, plasma, right, or ball lightning, things like this are things that in the literature, they've come to light in the last handful of years, to be fair, but it's largely been suppressed or ignored, or again, if it cannot be debunked, it will just be the author of the paper will be attacked. So for example, there's a paper out of the Ukraine Institute of Electron Physics called SGME, Slightly Generalized Maxwell Equations. The paper was attacked, but not the equations. My whole thing is, don't get emotional. And we know it's deliberate, but don't get emotional, don't attack, disprove, and calculate that it is wrong. Show in the data that it's wrong. But God forbid they actually do that, because then people at home will start to think and go, hold on a second. If this, in this particular paper, it shows this, that implies perhaps that certain, sorry, I gotta be vague here, certain things publicly are not actually the things that are being claimed to generate certain forms of power. And so that would imply that the people having the jobs to maintain such facilities, for example, are working for what? Right? Now, the question then becomes, okay, if people then go home and spend time thinking, like Einstein said, I think 99 times and nothing comes to me. I'm paraphrasing here, but he goes, I silence my brain and then all the answers come. While silencing the brain, like you said, to your point of leisure, relaxation, this idea of going for a walk in the woods. Do we think it's a coincidence that many of these individuals with money, not necessarily billionaires, but individuals with money who don't need to work a 9 to 5, spend a lot of time thinking, spend a lot of time going to what has been known as, think tanks? Is it a coincidence that, again, let's just take a look at the fact that billionaires spend tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars a year on think tanks. And what are they? They're people in rooms thinking of different perspectives of the same methodology and strategy and how it could be applied. But unfortunately, it's being applied for the largely for the worst of things, I would say. Now, with that said, this speaks to the idea of, bell-shaped curve. This idea of, creating, you always have people that scamper the curve, right? Now, unfortunately, from my experience, things seem to be changing, but I don't want to say, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a glass half full guy, but at the same time, I got to be realistic. Within the scientific community and elsewhere, it comes down to upsetting people's rice bowls. Simple as that. And they don't want their rice bowls upset. Simple. What if I told you, Ricky, that the stuff that I'm working on is not anything that I'm not unique to cracking it, that perhaps the method may be a little bit unique relative to our modern timeline, but not the underlying energy itself. That stuff's been cracked, I would dare to say, since the 1800s, scuttled by, covered up by bankers, things like this, private interests, you name it. But what's interesting about all of this is that we are being told to give value to something, in this case, money, that we are then being told to disbelieve when applied anywhere else. Now, the question then becomes, let's think about that for a moment. What you may say, Dave, what do you mean by that? Well, let's really think, what is the difference between, for example, imagination and intent? People say, well, Dave, imagining, I'm thinking of something. Wait a minute, hold on. Don't you have to think to give value to money? So what's the difference? We are giving value to something in which we are being told, when applied anywhere else, is complete nonsense. You can't give, God forbid this pen is given value that I can then give to you in a form of payment, because it is not controlled by certain entities. Right? So it speaks to this idea of a potential decentralization of things. Now, one last thing to wrap up my little ramble here is that, a lot of people talk about, this was the part that I forgot to finish my come full circle on. People talk about, well, spirituality is not real, this and that. Listen, I respect everyone's opinion. And again, for example, say you and I, Ricky, we go for a walk somewhere and you see a UFO in the sky, and you see a triangular craft. I see it in the same spot, but I see a square or a cube. Who's wrong or who's right? Neither, but both. It depends where you are viewing it from. Now, this idea of spirituality, I say to people, well, you believe in lasers, right? They go, yeah. I go, you believe in carbon monoxide, right? They go, of course. You can't touch it, but it's there. You see what I'm saying? Now, if that could then be observed in a laboratory and substantiated with data, changes the game a little bit. So that's what I'm trying to do with respects to SALT. Again, trying to take some of this public in that regard. Now, again, it's tough, but I'm trying. So it's one of those things where, for example, this idea of decentralization, where, again, people, I allude quite often to the subreddit r/I think anti-work, where, for example, sure, there may be, lazy people in that subreddit, but the idea that, a bunch of people come together and say, hey, we may not all have money, or a lot, we may not be wealthy, but collectively we got something. So I'm going to loan you a couple $1,000s, for example, because, someone may be having some issues, and people will say, pay me back in a few months from now. I'm not saying that is what is occurring on that subreddit, but that's the idea, ideally, in my opinion. Now, what happens if you have even just a millionaire come in with a couple $1 million and say, hey, I'm going to help all of you? There goes the need for property taxes. There goes the need for reliance on government. God forbid we have that, right? So it's kind of like, in my opinion, like the trucker protest as well. We see now what's coming out with respects, I don't mean to get political, but with respects to, as a Canadian, with respects to what's being released in the hearings now and all of that. And we see that there didn't seem to be any indication of terrorism or anything like this. This idea of people simply questioning, why am I doing this? What there's something more to this reality, to this life. Why am I getting up every day constantly, for example, like a robot, over and over again, doing the same things? And I only have 2 days of the week. Okay, maybe one day I spend with the family. The other day I spend, doing chores for my, parents or friends or something like this. I got 3 hours a week to myself. I deserve more. Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is, in my opinion, this is the problem. I think there's a way that some of this technology and knowledge can come out and can also be monetized in a way that is not overly greedy, but so that everyone literally and metaphorically eats. And I think that it can, I hope it can be done. So that's where I come from in that regard. And I'm not saying to people, hey, just because lasers exist and they're observable and we know they're real, you got to suddenly believe in ghosts. No, no, no. What I'm saying here to both you, sir, and to your audience is not to believe a word that I say. Just be open to it. That's it. That's it. Just be open to it. Just being open to things. That's all it's about. It's not about saying, okay, yeah, I got my earphones here. There's two earphones hanging here. It has to be just two. Maybe you see four. Who the hell am I to say that's wrong? When people say they see things with the corner of their eyes, some people say they saw Sasquatch. Another person says, I saw what looked like a gray alien in the same spot that you saw the Sasquatch. It's the science seems to show, just like the dual slit experiment, reality is only as real as the observer, as the person observing it. And I would liken that quite strongly to again, what merging the world of, I guess you could say, physics and metaphysics. But if you'll give me a moment, I do want to pull up for you a couple slides I'd love to share with your audience.
Yeah. Without a doubt. I mean, that's the thing. That's why I'm always attracted to people like yourself and Rupert Sheldrake and somebody. And it's funny how just like throughout all of history, and they say history repeats, and if it doesn't repeat it at least rhymes. Throughout history, like anybody who's ever had a really amazing breakthrough that really made people rethink things usually gets called a crazy person. And Rupert Sheldrake gets called pseudoscience. I think I went on his Wikipedia once and I'm like, pseudoscience. I'm like, this guy has actual experiments showing that if you teach mice this maze and mice in other locations, different locations that were never exposed to this maze and never exposed to those other mice, are learning the maze faster. And that's the thing. Like, just because we don't understand how it's happening doesn't mean there's not a explanation. We just haven't discovered it yet. Like you talked about historically, when you did not, we always try to find meat or understanding for things. So it's like when we didn't understand thunder and lightning, we said, oh, it's some god who was angry. It's like that was our explanation because of our lack of understanding. So there's a lot of things, the placebo effect, there's all these things, consciousness, whatever the soul may be, there's all these things that we might have not scientifically found out a way to explain it, but it doesn't mean that it can't. At some point, as our understanding expands, we can't scientifically explain it. It doesn't mean that it's all just natural. Everything that is scientific at some point was considered supernatural. It's right.
Yep, well, this speaks to what has been, our ancestors have said, the caduceus is the movement is life. Computer scientists are now hypothesizing that the transition, we could say string, or the transition string from one information node or energy nodal point, to another, is more significant than the node that it is going to next. Because once you get to that node, what's next? Once you buy that new iPhone, after a couple days, it's like, all right, sure. It's like, okay, whatever. So to your point, it's that concept of exploration. And I don't claim to have all the answers whatsoever. As a matter of fact, to tell you the truth, Ricky, the more I'm learning, every time I solve an equation, or for example, I, do something in an engineering sense, or I make an adjustment to one of my generators here, it's like, okay, hold on, how did that happen? And that is unexplainable until it can be explained. So that's the point. Which speaks to the idea of, duality and binary and all of that. And right before I share some slides, it speaks to something as well, where I think science without philosophy is like a plant without water, or a seed without water. They have to go hand in hand. Not because I want them to, but because at least to this point in time, and I would be glad to come on your show at some point in time to say, Ricky, I fucked up, I'm completely wrong. But at some point in time, there seems to be an intermergence between the two. The point of, I would dare to say, what we call disagreements may in fact be multiple perspectives of a varying subjective reality, which speaks to Hegel's dialectic. So that is antithesis, thesis, and then down the middle, synthesis, right? This idea of the mergence or balance of the two, right? So with that said, if I may, to make some direct correlations to Randall Carlson on Rogan with plasma, we see here a giant coil around a 12-foot long plasma tube. Now, a lot of people talk about, the number 12 being significant esoterically, archetypally, in an occult sense, the 12-strand DNA, things like this. So essentially, I will be honest with you, I've had to crop some of the slides because for various reasons, I can't show all of it publicly, but essentially, this was all the way back in the 50s where people would lie underneath this particular plasma tube and their cancers would be cured, which goes back to this idea of what we were saying before of books 1 to 10. If we are living in the reality of book 10 and our cells, for example, just to be clear, not a doctor, and our cells are, not well, what if one could, for example, take the cell and then, as what Dr. James Giordano and his colleagues out of DARPA have claimed at Naval War College with respects to if it's stackable, it's hackable. Well, okay, I don't think that's just digital. So if we can take a cell, a cancer cell, and stack on top of it a healthy one on book 10, and then that cancer cell doesn't even go to book 9, 8, 7, 6, all the way to 1, it just gets thrown out of the stack of books. Technically, you've cured whatever issue one had. I also think as well, I don't mean to speak on behalf of all individuals because there are many variables to this, but what some have claimed to be, bipolar disorder, ADHD, schizophrenia, autism, Asperger's, all of this. I think in some of those cases, perhaps more than what many may regard to be, accurate, those are individuals in which may in fact be what some have called omnipresent. They are meant to, I guess you could say, do multiple things at once, even outside of this reality, except we are being limited again, this speaks to much more of a grander, if you will, superstructure of things, but the idea that we may be limited within a confined state. And so speaking of confined state, here is the other slide that I have with respects to this idea from the Department of Defense. And again, if it's such nonsense, I don't know why the DoD has it, but again, to be fair, to play devil's advocate against myself, they do dump a bunch of money into stuff that does not pan out as well, to be fair. But we see here, for example, participants in a quantum potential share a common multiply connected space-time. And we see, for example, that individuals seem to be within this ring of, what we call, I guess you could say, Earth or a reality, but it connects back to what's labeled here. I did have to crop it because of what's underneath it, but what's connected back to what's called a source station. Now, this in many regards could be, I don't mean to fearmonger. This could be what some people say, is it the Saturn moon matrix? I don't know. But ultimately, it seems to speak to an idea that we as observers are the source of our own reality. And if I may say, before I finish rambling here, for example, say we are on the ground of the planet and we see a plane in the sky, very far high up. The farther the plane is, the more flat it is to us. Right? The closer the plane, the more depth it has, the more we can interact with it. If this water bottle was a kilometer away, to me, it's a flat bottle until I walk up to it and then grab it, and then it becomes interactable. Dare I say that is what perhaps the UAP phenomena and other paranormal events, including Sasquatch, Bigfoot, etc., could be harnessing amongst the plethora of other methods as well. I'm not saying that is the only way, but it speaks to this idea that if even a scientist is in his laboratory and he's trying to create, a free energy that becomes indiscernible from magic in the sense that there's depth. What do I mean by that? Well, imagine, I'll give an example for the ladies in the audience here. You go out and you have your purse with you and you forget, you say, oh crap, I forgot something back at home in the bedroom. You reach into your purse while you're, say, at a coffee shop with friends, and you reach and you open your purse, and as you look in, you see your bedroom, and you can reach into the purse and grab whatever you need in the bedroom and then pull it back out. That is what would be called fifth dimensional interactability with depth. Now, that's also what's called Riemannian manifolds and orbifolds using Ricci tensors, but in plain English, that's what our ancestors called magic. So it kind of becomes interesting after that point, right? So it's not that anyone is wrong, but not correct either. It's just like, well, then people may say, Dave, hold on a second. I'm watching you on Ricky's show. How is that possible if what you're claiming? Yes, but you're seeing a flat version of me. You are not seeing me with interactability, with depth. And now people may say, Dave, Well, there are VR headsets and things like that that can create depth. Yes, they're creating depth relative to the optical locality of you, but one cannot, for example, I guess you could say, interact with such depth until you are close to it. Again, you have to put the VR headset on, not your friend. You see what I'm saying? It's this idea of, for example, one last example, to pick up my glasses. If I place them a little bit far away from me, it takes me time to reach for the glasses and then grab them and then bring it back. So as my hand is reaching for the glasses, time is increasing relative to how long it takes for me to get there, but the distance between the object and me is decreasing. So this speaks to this idea that if we can manipulate and perturb and exploit perhaps that time perspective, could, for example, just like the film Inception, you want to go have an 8 hour, you want to plug yourself into something. And I don't mean to, I'm not for this chip in the brain type stuff. I think there's actually an organic way to do it, but relative to the natural heartbeat of the planet and what we call the Schumann resonance. But this idea of, you want to organically link into a lucid state where, for example, memories or certain experiences are induced where you've had maybe a 2-week vacation in Florida when really you just had an 8 hour sleep in your bed at home. I don't necessarily see the problem with that per se, because what's the difference between that and one's imagination? So now, to be fair though, there is a fine line in my humble opinion between, I think, like what we see, for example, at the World Economic Forum. I adamantly disagree with that. When Klaus Schwab says things like, in 10 years from now, we're all going to be able to read each other's minds and all that stuff. I would dare to say we already can organically. So when he says we're putting chips in the brain, okay, you're putting chips in people's brains. Pardon my profanity here. Why are you not giving the other fucking option a shot? Why? In my opinion, because they can't control it. So they don't even bring it up. They don't even admit to it. And this goes back full circle to what I was saying about if one cracks anti-gravity, you crack the rest, telekinesis, all of it, because it's the same underlying energies that can communicate at light speed with others mentally, telepathically. Now, I know some may, whether your audience or otherwise may say, well, it's complete nonsense. I say I respect that. Just be open to it. And if one is not open to it, then this could speak to what some have discussed as a reality split or whatever, but that's a whole other conversation. So
Yeah, well, one thing that I love about this conversation is that it makes you rethink everything in regards to like even UFOs. A lot of times, like you're stating, what we think we're seeing is all based on our current understanding of reality. So we think it must be a physical thing, but it doesn't, and I've seen Rogan doing episodes of late on UFOs and sightings. He's seems to be bringing this up much more often of late in regards to okay, maybe it's beyond our understanding, maybe or our current understanding. Maybe it's not just a physical thing. That's the way, like we assume everything has to be physical because that's the way we, right, based on our current senses. But it's the same thing like that, when you talk about DMT or you talk about any of these psychedelics, like, are you tapping into something? Or is it just a chemical thing that happens in your body? I mean, I always use and we can use pretty simple examples to get people to understand this. I mean, if you didn't, if you were alive before the radio, and you're trying to explain to somebody that you can put frequencies in the air and then this radio can pick up on it, it sounds like magic. But why can't humans do that, right? Why wouldn't we be able to maybe take a substance or something that or maybe people that, like you said, people that are slightly different, maybe they're not seeing maybe they're not crazy and that's why they're seeing things. Maybe they have some ability to pick up on a different frequency. I mean, sometimes I tell people, I'm like, how would you explain scent to somebody if we're animals without noses? Like it would be complete, or sound if we're animals without ears. Like everything, our understanding of the world, we put it in a box that is restricted by our senses and what, our explanations we've come to. But you have some amazing breakthrough in understanding of the world. It could change everything. It could turn everything upside down. Electricity, for example, before there was electricity, if you said that, hey, you could get some coil and you could put, I mean, I know people today who don't know how electricity is made, and you put a magnet through it really fast, all of a sudden it creates this energy, and you're like, what the fuck, what do you mean energy? Like, yeah, this that could power things. Like you could have light in houses. You could, you could power cars. You could power, all machines. You'd be like, wait, what? Like these two things, like this coil that alone seems to do nothing, and this magnet that alone seems to do nothing, can create this energy when you put it together. So it's like you have one breakthrough, and you take this giant leap in technology, and it's the same thing. I've heard you talk about vibrations, and that's why the water thing is so fascinating, because I think this idea that like that there's something more, right? That there's people act like nature and things we touch and feel, they're just material things, that there's not it couldn't have a memory, it couldn't have a consciousness, it couldn't. And the water thing is interesting because it kind of makes you rethink that. It's like,
Yep.
well, how do you explain this? Like, how do you, there must be something that we have not yet explained or understood, because this is happening. There's experiments showing that water is having is being affected by some outside thing that
Yeah.
we can't quantify. But yeah, so it maybe if we break that code, it opens the door to all these other understandings of the world.
Well, to your point, if I may address in a few different regards with respects to the craft, and I appreciate, man, your interest in this, because with respects to a craft, it is my understanding with respects to some of the consulting for certain governments and bodies that I'm doing at SALT. It is in, and I may be wrong, but this is just what I understand, and some people I've spoken to in actually some of them well-known names behind the scenes, who unfortunately, if I mention their names, they wouldn't be friends with me any longer, probably. But it is indiscernible from the average observer to for the average observer to discern or tell between whether the say a UFO one is seeing in the sky is a hologram, is something that is actually there, or is something in which is being perhaps consciously inserted into the mind through certain electromagnetic inductions, essentially. So it is indiscernible. And this is why when people say, well, we don't know what it really is, I agree. I completely agree. Now, in some cases, is it just a drone? Sure. Are there some drones that are using some of this anti-gravitic tech? Potentially, if you catch my drift. Are humans smarter than we may be led to believe? Absolutely, but that doesn't mean we haven't had help either. Now, with that said, to your second point of, again, this goes back to, the joys in the journey, and there can't necessarily be a theory of everything. Just like when you walk outside and you say, like a good friend of mine said, if you walk outside, you say, oh, it's snowing. Okay, but what is the snow comprised of? Well, Dave, it's crystalline this, ice that. Okay, what's that comprised of? And not to be a smartass, but we keep learning and continuing. Well, Richard Feynman, one of the most respected scientists ever. No, people don't have to listen to me. Richard Feynman said it. We do not have an adequate definition of what force is. We don't know what energy is to a certain extent. It goes to a certain extent, and then it's like, okay, then what is it? Well, it's this, it's this, it's this. No, what is that then? And then this is when, dare I say, people who have worked their way up the chain within the academic system start to get their ego involved. That's when the emotion comes into play, right? Where it's then they if they're too hesitant to confront you directly and say F off, they'll just kind of talk bad about you behind your back. They'll never talk to you again, this and that. This is the stuff that has to stop, in my opinion. This is the point. I want people to say, look what I built, or look what I made. And I want to say, congratulations. That's absolutely beautiful and fantastic. How can we make it better? Not any of this, for example, oh, you made this. Well, okay, I'm a little bit envious now because this and that. No, if one takes even 20 minutes a day to spend time to themselves and say to themselves, what do I like? And if one doesn't know, part of my profanity here, just fucking pick something and just try it. Because it's this idea of getting out of the comfort zone, right? And so with that said, it's this, again, it goes back to this overall idea of the joy is truly in the journey. Because if people, what pisses me off is when there's stagnation. There's people that don't like change. I want change. Now, yes, is there risk associated with it? Absolutely. But change is needed, because without change, there's stagnation. With stagnation, what comes after that? It's, dare I say, when we go down to the microscopic level, depression, right? So, for example, it's been, sorry, I can't go there, but yeah, you see what I'm saying.
I can tell you love philosophy as much as I do, and the one thing I love about philosophy is the fact that there was more questions than there are answers. Like I didn't like answers. Like I like because there should never be a definite answer because that's only based on somebody's interpretation or some a theory. That's the other thing I try to I remember telling my kids the other day, and my daughter's 6, my son's 7, and I'm like, listen, you're going to get a lot of theories in school. Like they're going to tell you gravity holds things down. Understand that that's all based on somebody's interpretation of the world. And
Right.
that's a theory. There's no way of knowing 100% that that is actually what is holding things down to the earth. We don't know when it's all based on, somebody's creative intelligence, some scientific experiments, whatever, and they came up with this theory. But everything's just a theory. That's why philosophy and science, like you said, they should be parallel in ways of thinking. Because what you should do, just like in philosophy, it's like, okay, this is my philosophy on reality or morals or politics or whatever. Somebody should question those things and dissect those things, and somebody should question that, and it should be endless amounts of questioning. Science should be the same way. It's like, okay, this is what makes up a snowflake. Well, what makes up those things? And then what makes up those things? And then what, like we stop at like it's almost like baking a cake and being like, okay, our understanding of baking the cake just has to be the ingredients. Like, okay, this is a cake. What makes up a cake? Eggs. And it's like, and flour. Okay. But let's never really figure out what is an egg or what is flour. No. Now let's figure out like what is an egg and what is flour. Okay, now what is those things? Like what? And just like you said, constantly peeling back. That's the only way you truly understand things. We have only peeled back a layer or two. There's endless amounts of layers that could make us completely rediscover things. I'd love to get your opinion on one, Bob Lazar, and
Sure.
some of the stuff that he and I love what he does, because he's like, I'm not saying this is anything, or I'm not giving you my opinion on what I think this is. He's like, I'm just telling you what I saw. This is what I saw. I can give you my explanation of what it might be, but I don't have a explanation. And then also because this is a topic that I've been so fascinated with for so many years, is Atlantis. And do you, if you think the stories of Atlantis is a example of or some evidence of like civilizations evolving, maybe cracking some of these codes, and maybe explaining some of the things like the pyramids and other things, and something that Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock said that was a really, really good point, because I think that a lot of times it's used to debunk some of these conversations. Is like, I can't remember if it was Randall or Graham who said, like, you could have one civilization in one place that cracks a code, and then you have you study some other civilization in another place on this planet that didn't crack that code. So you're like, hey, look, at this time period, these people they didn't know how to do this. But it doesn't mean that somebody else on another planet, because now we have the ability to where we can connect and we can share information. But at that time, that wasn't the case.
In other words, multiple things can happen. You can have one culture that's far behind another one on the other end of the planet. I agree. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
I would say, sort of cut you off, but if I may go in order with respects to Lazar, I remain skeptical on some claims, and other claims I think he's bang on. Now, I will get specific for you. Element 115, I'm not saying it's BS. I'm not at all. I don't know anything about it. I'm of the humble opinion, based on my own experiments and experience, that it's not needed. Some sketches he's made of what he saw, the certain gravity amplifiers, as he called them, or gravity generators, of where he claimed the element 115 was being put into. I would encourage people to focus more on the gravity amplifiers than element 115. I think, I'm of the humble opinion, too many individuals are focused, and I could be wrong, but too many people are focused on the nuts and bolts of what the craft is made out of in various forms, as opposed to what is being done to the craft or to the material instead of what the material is made of, if that makes sense.
Are you talking about maybe the vibration thing? Because I've heard you talk about this, how everything has a vibration, and if you can get the right frequency and the right, you could manipulate things, move things, cut things, change things.
I would say this has to do with what's been called quantum electrodynamic or quantum loop gravity with respects to what's called the Schwinger limit, where essentially string theory, or at one point what is normally known as angular momentum, goes from like a slanted line eventually to, when it gets spun quick enough, into a spiral. And I would say that would be the case. I do agree very strongly with Randall Carlson when he said that this particular technology harnesses plasmoids or plasmas, and that it uses a particular resonant frequency. I think this resonant frequency is also what the Egyptians used for the pyramids. I think the pyramids was not one or two different things. I think it was a multi-pronged tool or apparatus for various reasons. And again, I would, if I may give as much of a hint as I can, one is playing with the platonic solids. In other words, the circle, the triangle, the cube, and the icosahedron, all that kind of stuff. But just like, for example, people talk about using different types of fluids. Allegedly the Nazis used liquid mercury to try and get some of their craft going, the Die Glock, the alleged Nazi bell. The fluids work. Not necessarily liquid mercury, but fluids work. There's also another form of it called, electrogravitics, where it's strictly, electricity, magnetism, and one or two other, I guess you could say, missing components, in which on the modeling side of Einstein's general relativity, Einstein was not wrong in general relativity. There was something missing. And I believe he knew it long before he passed. It just never went public. As well as with respects to Atlantis, I do believe it definitely existed. The reason I say that, I'd be inclined to believe in it based on some of the things that I've been doing at SALT specifically. There are certain things, brother, I'll be honest with you, that one cannot be exposed to certain pieces of knowledge or information without being exposed or putting the pieces of the puzzle together in other regards. That's why to be honest with you, that's why I started my own company, because I didn't want to go under NDA under anyone else. If I was going to go under NDA, it was going to go under myself, so I can limit what I could say. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say like, I have freedom to talk about everything and anything. There is a red line. So because, then I'll basically get disappeared, so to speak, but I'm trying to push it as much as I can. And I think a lot of this stuff should come out. But with respects to Atlantis, just one example, there's a former Russian general, ambassador, doctor, I believe as well, Leonid Ivashov. And he has written a book strictly in Russian. I don't know if he submitted for it to be printed in English or other languages, or if it was simply denied. But he basically said that, NASA spent, we could say, many millions of dollars looking to retrieve a particular Stargate or arc or object that could only be indiscernible from magic. Now, can it be scientifically substantiated? I know this is a bold claim to make without any physical proof of anything right next to me, but in my humble opinion, absolutely. It just like philosophy, the result is the same, but how we get to that result are different methodologies. It's the same way, for example, with people who crack different forms of anti-gravity. It's some people said, well, no, I did it this way. Another person said, well, I did it this way. Perfect. Now we have multiple ways to do it. There's not the way, there are a set of ways, if you will. I wish I could say infinite, but I do believe it's limited relative to the reality we're in, but that's another thing. But ultimately, yes, I would say, yeah. So with respects to Lazar as well, he's, I don't think he's wrong at all about when he talked about when he saw the craft and he said there was no, what was the word? It was very smooth, so to speak. I think, for example, as well, that when he talked about, this ball that sort of when you pushed against it, it had a magnetic force. I 100% agree with that. And again, to you and your audience, that's just me, but based on my certain things, and I would say 100%. But with respects to this whole element 115, it could be real. It could be perhaps even something that, and I say this with no disrespect to him, maybe a name or a label he gave that's not the actual label that he deliberately knew so that he could speak about it without getting disappeared. Now, rebuttal to that as well is, well, he's disinfoing us. And I know this is when it gets tough. I don't claim to agree with that. And I'm not saying that's what he's doing, but I do think that this element is not needed.
Now, are you familiar with the company that Randall Carlson or the group of researchers that he was talking about that have been working on some of this technology and has, broken some of these codes on energy or reality or consciousness or whatever they're working on? And he said that in a couple months they're going to open source it. And are you're aware of any of this? And do you think it sounds like in the very near future you'll be able to openly talk about this in much deeper?
Let's so sorry, I gotta just think very quickly here to watch my words. I hope it gets open sourced. I think as well, I'm of the humble opinion, what he said there was a strategy and tactic to move the ball forward collectively, to get others to come out with this stuff. Now, when he talks about abundant energy, I believe he's being careful because, okay, this is what I'm working on with SALT with respects to the larger picture. If one could manipulate the reality we're in a conscious sense, one can then manipulate what would be originally free energy when it's hidden to then becoming abundant but still limited when it's brought out. So unfortunately, I think there still will be a control mechanism. I'm not trying to look at it glass half empty. I hope it gets open sourced, but even if it does get open sourced, there's still going to be a lot of, I'll be honest with you, man, I hope it happens. I really do. Based on what I'm seeing behind the scenes from my perspective, unfortunately, and I would say this with the utmost respect to Mr. Carlson, I don't think it's going to be Mazda. I hope I'm wrong. I genuinely hope I'm wrong. But if it gets open sourced, that would be awesome. I would, as a matter of fact, if it gets open sourced, what I can then do is I can then come back on your show or go public and say, listen, this is some of that type of energy, but let's go even one step further, because what does propulsion mean? What does anything even mean if the reality we're in is limited to the set of rules that the game maker has put? So imagine if this stuff does get open sourced. If we were, and I say this very hypothetically, if we were living in a simulation that our governments have collectively perhaps agreed on to perturb and manipulate, there could be memory wipes. There could be, which can be scientifically substantiated. There could be as well. And I'll give you an example. We have a Canadian company that basically is coming out with this concept where you buy the car, but you rent the battery. So and why rent the battery? Well, it never dies, but you got to rent it still. So again, we'll see what happens. I don't want to, again, interestingly enough, I think 48 hours after Carlson brought it up on Rogan, there was an explosion in roughly around the location that he had claimed these experiments were being done. I am not saying that this explosion is what created that. This is purely speculation or caused that facility to blow up or anything. I'm not saying it did at all. With that said, the individual as well working on this has been in the past accused of scams and things like that. But to be fair, that's what people who've cracked stuff have always been accused of whenever they want to go public with it. So in other words, sorry for dodging the question, but I think that if it does come out, it's gonna be limited to the way in which people still need to rely on some type of control system. But I hope it comes out. I hope it gets open sourced. But I think, I hope it gets open sourced. But I think there's still something much bigger than even that, because it's like saying, for example, imagine you put your VR headset on and we're playing a virtual reality game, and you say, "Oh, Dave, in this virtual reality, you're going to get an unlimited amount of money." You say, I say, Ricky, that's all fine and dandy, but tomorrow morning I got to take this headset off and go to work. You see what I'm saying? So if we scale it like that, there's something bigger than that. So in other words, this is what I meant when I had spoken in the beginning of our conversation here. with respects to there are people behind the scenes that believe in this stuff 1,000,000,000%, whether it's journalists of very high reputable credibility, whether it's celebrities of various kinds in various industries, some of which I've spoken to a plethora of them who have, and some of which I have contracts with, who have said, Dave, we know this stuff. We approach you because it sounds crazy publicly, but behind the scenes, we've been abducted for years. We've had this, we've had that, we've had manifestation experiences. People are simply, I guess you could say, there's a lot of moving parts. Some people are ready, some aren't. So that's one of the services I offer as well. And this idea of, for example, we can have an abundant amount of energy, but what about the outcome of a particular event? For example, what about, I can tell you that there are military intelligence services that have existed for decades that have actually used what's been called remote viewing, but even other methods with more perhaps data-driven, data-backed, solidified experimental results, actually applicable results that show there are services offered to select individuals and groups at the very top levels of business and private industry and federal governments where a handful of outcomes can be seen, whether using technology or a person or a bit of both. So there's multiple angles this can be played. So just like, for example, I hope it gets open sourced, but there may be, for example, the same way that Linux is open sourced. You then have Linux Pro, Linux Plus. But either way, it's a step in the right direction. So yeah, I hope it does get open sourced.
Damn, I gotta go soon, but I don't want to end this conversation. This is going, Dave. It's funny because last time you're on the You've Unwanted, and if people haven't listened to it, please check it out. It was supposed to be a Halloween special, and which really turned into an amazing conversation because of some of the stuff that you brought to the table that started. I think you could see a lot of people on the panel kind of connecting the dots with some of the stuff you were saying and explain some of the stuff that they were saying. And I think that's the beautiful thing about humans, right? It's like we're capable of so much more. And that's why it's funny because I like Patrick Bet David. He's had our mutual friend Whitney Webb on, and Richard Gage recently, and Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Peter McCullough. I give him a lot of respect, but he lives in the world of business and ones and zeros, which makes you very successful in this world if you just like basically stay in this material realm and look at everything from the material perspective. And it's like it's all about ones and zeros and money and production and whatever, and things you could quantify and touch or whatever. But that stuff is so boring to me. I mean, I could care less about financial advice or I'm like, I love these type of discussions because I think we've barely scratched the surface in understanding our ancestors, our history, the world around us.
Ricky, right before we end it, if I may say, just to give you one thing in your audience to ponder on from a scientific perspective, our ancestors would call certain sky gods, if you will, which we can now maybe perhaps allude to as crafts, UAPs, as coming through what's been called serpent ropes. I would ask your audience and yourself to ponder and think on this. And I'm not saying there is a right or wrong answer, but what's the difference between a serpent rope and what we now call traversable wormholes? So makes you think, right?
Yeah, well, that's the thing about the knowledge of our ancestors. I mean, so many things seem like we're not discovering it, we're rediscovering it, right? Like this whole idea of I'm big in diet, nutrition, and whatnot. Like people are talking about the gut being the second brain, and I'm like, well, we've been saying I have a gut feeling forever. Like, where do you think that came from? Like, there was this understanding of it before we actually understood it. I remember when I was really young, I got food poisoning, and somebody told me to eat like burnt toast. And I'm like, what the fuck does burnt toast do? And I'm looking at everything from like a logical perspective. I'm like, how is a burnt piece of bread gonna help me? And then as I got older, I was like, oh, it's the charcoal. The charcoal kills the bacteria. The person who was telling me to eat the burnt toast, of course, because I'm a super curious person and I like to push back. I'm like, can you explain to me how this would work? Like how does this make any sense? And but they couldn't explain it, but it didn't mean it didn't work. It just means they couldn't explain it. And so that's kind of like a metaphor for like everything we're talking about. It doesn't mean it doesn't work or it doesn't exist. It just means we can't explain it yet. Once I understood that, okay, the charcoal kills the bad bacteria in your stomach, I'm like, okay, now we've scientifically explained it. But it didn't mean that it didn't work, and it didn't mean that that person was crazy. It just meant that you could discover something or understand something to some extent, and maybe you don't understand to the level of like actually breaking down exactly the mechanism of everything and how everything is working. But I think that's probably one of our problems with like dismissing things too quickly, right? It's like we can't explain it immediately. How does this work, or how is this happening? Then it must be pseudoscience. It must be supernatural. It must.
I'll be honest with you, brother. It becomes threatening and I look, I'll be honest, particularly for individuals who have genuinely worked hard within the system that they were raised and brought up in, especially within academia, various branches of all branches, really, to have, for example, someone like yourself come along and be open to these things. And meanwhile, the head of a science advisory committee never was, and still isn't, because they keep getting with there's forgive me, but there's no other way to explain it. They've been getting so many checks for so long to not look into those things, that now all of a sudden, for example, Ricky Varandas all of a sudden has this phenomenal idea, but because he's not Ricky Varandas PhD, it can't be applied. This is where there's a lot of things that, looking back, I didn't agree with Steve Jobs on and things like this, but one of the things I agreed with him on was the best ideas have to win. If you are in a room, and maybe there's more than one best idea, there can be more than one. If you're in a board meeting, say you and me are in a room and there's 10 other people, highly respected individuals, executives, and then we're spitballing ideas for marketing or business, whatever, and then a janitor comes in and says, sorry to interrupt, guys, but what do you think of this? And that janitor has the best. I'm fucking going with the janitor's idea, because it doesn't matter who it came from. In my opinion, it matters what the idea, the substance of the idea, and what can we do with it next to make it better, to improve.
And
That's
a lot of the people who are experts in a field are limited with their ideas, because what happens is that they become an expert by learning. I had this conversation with Dr. Jessica Rose, because we talked about, I had her co-host when I had Dr. Thomas Cowan on the last time I had him on, because I was curious on her perspective on all this stuff. Me and I don't know if it was on the air or off the air, but we talked about Dr. Peter Duesberg, the guy who was on Rogan's years ago, and very fascinating conversation and fascinating person who made people rethink, like, okay, is this virus actually causing the disease? And people are just like, oh yeah, I accept this as the way things work. And then you get somebody who's like, no, like there's no real evidence. And that's something I've talked to Dr. Jessica Rose on, because it's like you go to a university, you're taught these are
that guy's a genius, by the way, in my opinion. That guy's a genius.
Yeah,
I've read some of his work. He's on the money, in my opinion.
Well, you have these foundation, like your foundation is based on these principles, right? So all your ideas and all your perspectives and all your personal philosophies and your worldviews are based on that foundation. But what happened is the university and the experts that came before you gave you that foundation. So you could build this house in this direction a little bit, in that direction, up, but you can't really leave that foundation. And that foundation is going to restrict all the ideas that you build on top of it. So like I keep telling Dr. Jessica Rose, or I've told her, and we're having this conversation. I'm like, listen, I'm like, you need to like rethink everything. I'm like, my problem with like being an expert in a field is like you have this foundation that restricts you. I'm like, how about we take steps backwards? And we're like, okay, what are these theories that like germ theory and all these things? So like all your ideas on the world are based on like germ theory and all these theories that came before you, that somebody has said, hey, this is like your worldview is based on this. You can expand off this, but you can't question this. Go back. Go.
If I may say one last thing, I know you got to go. To that point, I think this has to do with this idea of upsetting people's rice bowl at the top with respects to, they want to make us think. And when I say they, I'm speaking particularly financial interests in various elements of the military industrial complex on a global level, and the media industrial complex as well, and Wall Street, that only they can do what they do. Right? They use these fancy terms, all these, I got to this and that. I'm not trying to take away from the vast amount of hard work and education that people have put into things, not at all. But to your point of, okay, someone's taken, the blue path, there's also a red path and a purple path and a green path. And maybe some of those paths, in fact, intersect. But the fact that they're not even willing to consider or be open to it, that's the problem. I'm not sitting here saying I have the answer. Yes, in fairness, I'm claiming I've cracked a set of answers, but that's only led me to more questions, brother. Right? So this, and I'll be honest with you, I will say this is the first time I've said it publicly. Nobody has ever come at me, whether on social media or otherwise, other than just saying, "Oh, you know, you're full of crap" or whatever. Because again, I know these without saying the names, it becomes it's unsubstantiated. But those that will watch this or listen to this, and those in academia, that many of them know who I am, and that's why they'll say we're familiar with your work and what you're doing, but we're not allowed to comment on it publicly. But then behind the scenes they go, "Hey, give me your number, let's talk." I'm not kidding. So it becomes a very interesting thing, right? If so, again, I'm 24. If there's a 17-year-old kid that has an idea on something, that I don't care that he's 17. I'm not going to get pissed that he's 17. Oh, because I didn't crack it when I was 17. So I have to do everything I can emotionally to put him in the ground, metaphorically, right? And shame him. No. We all have a different piece of that pie or pizza. Some of us have yet to find it, in my opinion. That's how I see it, basically. So that's to your point. This idea of, again, you're a chemist, stay in your lane. You're a propulsion physics guy, stay in your lane. You're an engineer, electrical engineer, you're a ceramics engineer, stay in your lane, over and over and over. It doesn't end. Now, with that said, I wish there are some university courses I could take, but because I can't, I'm trying to self-teach. But at the same time, there are other courses I'm so glad I didn't take, because it would have butchered my view and it would have prevented me from obtaining a new perspective on old physics. This is, in my opinion, this doesn't go outside the laws of physics, brother. A lot of this stuff, whether it's anti-gravity, telekinesis, it's in there. It's a new perspective on the old stuff. So that's yeah.
Learning guitar, right? If somebody teaches me this is how you play guitar, then I'm kind of restricted to like, oh, these are the principles of playing guitar. It's these chords, it's this. Yeah. So now I have restrictions on my imagination because I was told these are the principles. And then you get somebody who is self-taught, and like I self-taught myself, but there's plenty of really good self-taught. I wasn't that good, but there was some of the best guitarists, or at least the most revolutionary musicians in general, or artists in general, are people who are self-taught. Like they kind of they do things against the grain. They do things that maybe you wouldn't even attempt to do or try to do if you weren't self-taught. And a lot of times, a lot of breakthroughs happen by people who aren't experts in those fields. It's somebody who's coming at it from a different perspective, looking at it from a completely different point of view, because they weren't restricted by being I'm an expert in this field. These are the principles that I follow. These are the theories that I've adopted, and they must all be true. I can't question these things, and that's it. So that's what makes this all so fun, because I do feel like we're living in a time where we could really, technology is advancing at a certain rate, and then
we're doing a disservice to ourselves, brother, to your point, if we don't say, hold on a second, it's not what to think, it's how to think, and also at the same time question all of it.
Well, that's the thing. Like, a lot of times people in the alternative media community, they say question everything in regards to like government conspiracies or whatever it may be. I'm like, you should question everything. Like, that's it. Like, period. And like everything. There should.
I'm a hypocrite to this day. We're all hypocrites to some extent. I know you really have to go, but this idea, for example, if people talk about supporting a particular political viewpoint, but they're saying that while they're using the phone that was manufactured by ways and means that completely contradict the viewpoint these people are promoting. We're all hypocrites. We're all, including myself, we're all, man. The question is, to what extent are we consciously aware of it or not, in my opinion.
Yeah. And that's, I love what you're doing. I wish you the best of luck. We'll definitely have to get together soon. And you're Canadian?
Yeah.
I should have known, because you guys are always so damn polite.
I can say to you and your audience, I'm actually at a facility doing some consulting right now, just staying in a room here, but in the States. But yeah, that's why I'm Canadian, based out of Toronto.
Oh yeah, I could have guessed. You guys are some of my politest guests throughout. I've been Canadian. Corbett was obviously one of the first guests, big guests on my show, super polite. And it's like every Canadian came after him was super, super nice. To Adam Scorgi. I actually just had Matt Ebert. How does I don't know how to pronounce his last name. It's like RT, I think, something like that. But he's from Canada, another super polite, awesome guy. You guys are doing some amazing work up there, and thank you so much for the thought-provoking conversation. I can't wait to see what what you're
I appreciate it, man.
some of this stuff and kind of open up. And I hope that Randall Carlson is right, that hopefully in the next couple months, Rogan seems so interested in it, he might force him to have to disclose some stuff on online and or on a podcast, and hopefully it opens up a can of worms in regards to getting the information out there and forcing everybody to have to learn about this stuff. But before I do let you go, we do also need to plug everything you're doing. Let people know how they can connect with you, your websites, any social media platforms you're on, your podcast. I know you're still on YouTube, one of the few of us who are still on YouTube, and anything else, please.
I appreciate it. Well, first and foremost, Generation Z, ZED podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and YouTube, of course, as well as patreon.com/Generation Z. The days where I'm doing a lot more thinking, as we discussed earlier, than actual work with Salt or doing stuff with the show. I'm doing a little bit of tweeting, and I'm trying to push it to the extent that I can with revealing as much as I can at Podcast Z on Twitter. I also do once a week. Usually I release them on Sundays, sometimes jointly with a friend, other times alone, davez.substack.com. And I appreciate any support, whether it's just, verbally or financially or otherwise. I think ultimately it's a matter of supporting one another in a very decentralized fashion, because without people actually, as a matter of fact, Ricky, I used to exercise last winter listening to some of your interviews, and I gained insights from some of your interviews that I'm now applying to some of this stuff. So it speaks again to this idea, if I may say one final thing, that people always talk about, they're looking for that missing key, that classified document, whether it's the UFO world or otherwise. There are things out there, folks. You got to look, but it's there. There are things out there, there's data out there that may not be, when scattered, may not be considered classified, but when compiled in a particular order, in a chronological sense to disseminate a particular picture, becomes classified. So in my opinion, it's out there. It's just, again, you got to want it. So I'll end it with the whole, you can bring the horse to water, you can't make it drink. And I always add a little bit to the end. If you put a gun to its head, what's the point? Because then it's just going through the motions. So just like when you're at the gym, your mind, your soul has to be into that bench press, that curl. You need to feel the pump of the muscle and the blood rushing, not just stand there and go, duh, 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 and just curl like randomly. Then that's just going through the motions. So
yeah, without a doubt. And I'm hoping at some point in our lifetime there's going to be some 0 point energy technology type thing.
There will. I can tell you now, there will. If it's not Mazda, someone else will do it soon. It's not. That's why what we're doing at Salt is we're trying to look and I don't mean this in a derogatory manner, but we're trying to look much larger than just propulsion or just energy in that regard, more than just space travel. We're trying to look at, I know it sounds absurd, but entering, dare I say, other worlds and manipulating or creating one's own world without the use of chips in the head and things like that. So more organically, there's a way to do it organically. There absolutely is. And I would not have been able to be given an audience with very high level individuals from DOD and otherwise if there wasn't. So
interesting. Yeah. Let's resist the digital world, because there's too much in the natural world that we haven't yet discovered, and I think could blow the, we look at like the digital world as like, we've met the threshold of in this material world. Now we have to go into the digital world for maximum entertainment and value and all this stuff. It's like, no, man. I mean, there's probably a lot there is a lot that we still don't understand, and hopefully we some of this stuff will actually come to light in our lifetimes, and it's
sometimes it'll take a company like Mazda to be the first one to do it so that everybody else follows, to move the ball forward. So yeah, I mean, again, I hope it happens. I hope it does. But this is the thing as well. This unfortunately, via the indoctrination and the propaganda over the years, they butchered it so goddamn much that I fear that even if it does come out, people will have a hard time understanding it. So even if it is open source, I'm not trying to be glass half empty. It's just, it's unfortunate, but don't get me wrong. It's beautiful that this stuff will come out. I don't know when, but whether it's Mazda or someone else, as it stands right now behind the scenes, brother, it'll come out.
That's
Not, unfortunately, not free, perhaps abundant, but it'll come out.
we live in some crazy times. Hopefully.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Dave, for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Everybody. Please check out his podcast. Follow him on Twitter. I know you still have a YouTube channel. Check him out on YouTube, and I'm sure we'll talk again in the near future. Dave, keep up.
Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. Cheers.
Take care.